Hi, it's Roz, and I'm here today to talk about two new releases. And yeah, which one I think was a goodie and which was a real disappointment. Yeah, kind of hot or flop. That I think is the theme here. And these books, one is Here We Are by Graham Swift, and the other is Hamnet by Maggie O'Farrell. I really wanted to read both of them. They both came out sort of in the last, well, in the beginning part of 2020. So they're sort of hot off the press, and I wanted to read them because they're both by authors that I like or admire or have enjoyed previous books by. And I had high hopes of both books, and in one case that was sadly disappointed. So I'm going to start with the disappointment, and that was the book by Graham Swift. Here We Are. Now, Graham Swift wrote one of my favourite books of the 1980s, which was Waterland. Here it is. Look at that very grey, it's quite kind of cover with just a little bit of land and water at the bottom. That kind of sums up the book pretty well, in fact, because it's one of those novels with a really strong sense of place, and the place in that book is England's Fenland. The Fens are in on the east of the country, and they're kind of like reclaimed land, so very flat, a bit bleak. In some ways relatively kind of isolated communities, because they're kind of on the way to nowhere, nobody just passes through there. Waterland, great book. That was 1983. Then 1996 he wrote another real goodie that I enjoyed a lot called Last Orders, which people compared to Faulkner's As I Lay Dying, which I think is, it would be completely unfair to say it was in any way plagiaristic, although I think you can tell that Swift had read As I Lay Dying. But it's great because it's a story about older men, middle-aged men and older men, like mates, and they're taking a journey to shake someone's their friend's ashes into the sea, as he wanted, and then get to the pub for last orders because he enjoyed a drink in the pub. Very satisfactory book. I didn't love it as much as Waterland, but I did really enjoy it. Then he had a bit of a kind of quite a long fallow period as far as I'm concerned. I didn't like any of the books that he wrote in the next kind of decade or so. I think Last Orders was mid-90s, so yeah, I had a good, all the way through till just the other year, 2016, when he wrote a novella called Mothering Sunday that I thought was superb. I'd kind of like given up on him, and then I read that and I thought, wow, this author's rediscovered his enthusiasm and his special qualities in writing. He's always written kind of quite cool prose, but Mothering Sunday was a novella, quite short, but moving, profound, I think is the word one might use. That's a big word to use, isn't it? But I think, I would go for profound. So when I heard he had another novella coming out, I thought, okay, so maybe novella's his new thing, and maybe this one is going to be good too. And this was so disappointing, and that's so sad. And the setup for it is that it's 1959 in Brighton. Well, I live in Brighton. Brighton in 1959 was a very interesting place. If you've ever read Brighton Rock, or you've watched Quadrophenia, those are sort of either side of the 1950s, if you see what I mean. And Brighton in the 20th century, middle part of the 20th century, was a hot and exciting place. It still is, as far as I'm concerned. But it was kind of dirty, slightly dangerous, seedy, but it's also a bit glamorous. perfect place to set a good novella. And this one is set on the pier, and he does a thing that he's a kind of typical Graham Swift device, is that we have like 1959 and then something that's probably the present day and someone looking back. Yeah. So really promising setup, and then it was just really pedestrian. Never felt like it was really in Brighton. And I know, when you live somewhere, sometimes you're disappointed in a book that doesn't portray the place you come from. But there's just so much you could do with Brighton in the 1950s, and he doesn't. It could have been set anywhere really. The only thing that sets it on the pier is the fact that every now and then they talk about, the sea is underneath us, which half the time, of course, it isn't when the tide comes out. So that's a load of rubbish. If you look, I'm just trying to show you the print here. So we've got big print, big spaces. So it's not that long a book. So less than 200 pages, and very widely spaced, shall we put it? Because there's a real dearth of inspiration in this book. It's not that it's not well written. He writes, he has a nice style, and he still has a nice style. Actually, even his style is not so hot here, because he ends up, would you believe, in a book this short, he actually ends up kind of almost repeating himself quite a lot, which I found really hard to understand. So, as far as I'm concerned, don't bother. Waste of time. There's some good moments, some good ideas, some interesting stuff about like the experience of evacuees, some time shifts, but no, insubstantial and not worth it. There we go. I don't often really slag off a book, do I? But I felt cheated. I'm so glad I didn't buy it, actually. This came from the library. I still have it because the libraries are closed here because of coronavirus, but otherwise it would have gone straight back with a flea in its ear. Yeah. The other new release that I've read is by Maggie O'Farrell. Now, Maggie O'Farrell is kind of another British author. She was born in Northern Ireland, but she grew up in like Wales and Scotland, and she's a kind of multi-purpose Brit, as it were. And she wrote her first novel. Her first novel came out in 2000, and it was called After You'd Gone. And I read that and was absolutely hooked at the time. Really kind of drew me in, really when you come across a new author and you think, yes, this is exciting, I hope she can live up to this in her future novels, because some people do really one good first novel and then that was all their inspiration used up, whereas I'm glad to say she's brought out another book every 2 to 3 years since 2000, so 7 since the first one, and they've all been good. They've varied, and some are better than others, but every single one has been well worth reading. None has been like a disappointment to me. And so hearing that she had another new one coming out this year, Hamnet, I was quite excited, and a bit worried that I might be disappointed, because it's a shift for her, because it's the first kind of like historical novel. Well, The Vanishing Act of Esme Lennox that she wrote kind of goes back to Victorian times, but this is real kind of more historical fiction that almost sort of links Victorian times more into the present day, whereas this is full on historical fiction, because what she has done is she's written a book about Anne Hathaway. So a book about Shakespeare, but not really about Shakespeare, very much about his family life, about back in Stratford, about his family, about her, about his children, and about his son Hamnet, who sadly dies of the plague. It's not a spoiler, everybody knows that, don't they? Age 11. And she was struck by the fact that the name Hamnet and Hamlet were basically interchanged. There were two versions of the same name, and people might be called either, and it would be seen as the same name, and that he's had a son who called Hamnet, who dies when he's 11, and 3 years later he writes Hamlet, perhaps his greatest tragedy. We can argue about that another time. We'll leave that there for now. And she felt that there had to be a connection, that, you know, it can be a bit boring when you try and explain everything that a writer writes by events in their personal life. You know, for goodness sake, you can't possibly do that with Shakespeare, can you? But she felt that how could he choose to write a book, a play about a character, a young man, not young, but young man with the same name as his dead son, without there being some reason there. And then that's what got her into writing this book. And it is very, very obvious that she was totally enthused by this subject matter. And, you know, this book, Hamnet, is written with love, I would say. Yeah, real love, which is lovely. It's still, that wouldn't necessarily guarantee that it would be a good book, though. I have to say, and that was my worry. The thing that I know about Maggie O'Farrell from all the books I've read is that she's a good storyteller. Her style is nice. It's not flashy, but she's a good storyteller. They're very readable, but they're not simple or obvious. They're not plodding. That is probably the worst, one of the worst things I can say about a book is that it's plodding. She never writes a plodding book. She likes to do shifts in time. She likes to do shifts in perspective, and she does that in Hamnet, particularly but shifts from perspective, because we get Hamnet himself, we get William Shakespeare, although she's never called that. He's always like her father, the husband, the son, which is interesting. And then we get Anne Hathaway, or Agnes, as she's called in this book, and she conjures up the period really successfully, which is what you want in historical fiction. You don't want to be thinking, oh, this feels like the 21st century, but they're just using a few oldie-worldy kind of things to make it seem, you know, it feels genuinely set in its time. There's a sort of a good sense of place again in Stratford. You know, you can tell she spent time there and kind of soaked it up. The language works. It's not kind of deliberately kind of historical, but it doesn't feel anachronistic. All of that is lovely. There's an element in this book which I'm not so keen on. This won't put off many people, but it's something that is just a personal kind of dislike, I suppose, which is when you bring into historical fiction and a lovely kind of quite, it's almost quite realistic novel, and you kind of throw in a bit of a supernatural element. It's a popular thing to do, and I'm always slightly disappointed by it. I feel like, oh, you didn't need to do that. So the Anne Hathaway character, she's a herbalist, daughter of a herbalist. That I'm good with that. That's fine. But there's this kind of second sight thing going on where she can like hold someone's hand and get a sense of their past or their character, you know, and you could just say, oh, she's a very perceptive person, or in this, but oh, and there's bits that I buy, like her sort of wanting to connect with her dead mother when she's giving birth. Yeah, I can understand that. And finding it a comfort that she sees a rowan tree and her mother's name was Rowan, you know, yeah, I can buy all that, but I don't really want the second sight bit. Having said that, this was such a good book in other respects that absolutely didn't spoil this for me, and it kind of dominates the first half of the book more, and by the second half of the book it kind of goes away a bit, because what you get in the second half of the book is a really, really beautiful and special exploration of grief and bereavement and losing a child, and the idea that, you know, back in those times, oh, lots and lots of children died, so people didn't care if their children died, of course, is rubbish. You know, if your 11-year-old dies, boy, you care a lot, don't you? And so that is the beauty, the best thing about the book, I suppose. Her grief, his grief, and how the siblings deal with it, and how it affects their relationship. Yeah, good stuff. The other thing in the book that I really liked is there's a chapter in the first half that is an absolute tour de force. One of those kind of like, ooh, this you slotted this in, and it's clever, but it's not irritatingly clever. It's satisfyingly clever, and that's a chapter about the plague and kind of following the journey of the plague through the flea, as it were, or sequence of fleas, all the way from kind of across Europe and Istanbul and Constantinople as it was then, and Venice, and yeah, all the way through to London and then to Stratford, and that, yeah, book's worth reading just for that chapter alone, I think. So, one disappointment, one real pleasure. Have a great week, and if you've read either of these books, I would love to hear your opinion. Maybe I've been a bit too harsh on Graham Swift. Maybe I've been too kind to Maggie O'Farrell. So tell me what you think. Bye.